Hello, I'm Frank Wright, and today I'm going to talk to you about tribal war. There's been a lot of talk about civil war. I think this is dubious for many reasons, but the main one is that you're already in one. The idea that there's going to be a kinetic civil war, a shooting war, I think questionable at best, and I think it carries water for the liberal system that have created the conditions of crisis we now inhabit. Why do I say that you're already in one? Briefly, if you are the reading type, you could read my work on the Substacks, all about how the liberal democratic system is a war system. It was created during and after World War I. Its propaganda system got the United States into that war, and at the end of it, the European order was washed away and replaced with over 20 liberal democracies, one of which, the wonderful Weimar Republic. Moving swiftly along from that historical gap in our collective memory, I wonder who put that there. What you have to ask now is, are there other forms of warfare? And yes, there are. There's, of course, what we call information warfare, but I would argue further that our entire culture, its traditions, its customs, and its sense of reality is in fact produced by a form of warfare on our entire civilization. How could I say such a thing? What kind of extremist spouts this paranoid nonsense? Well, if you take one look around you, whether within your house or outside it, at work, going to the hospital, or wherever it is that you find yourself, you'll see the symbols of what you might call the state religion. These symbols, messages, slogans are everywhere. They're in the terms and conditions of your employment, on your online and offline life. They govern your politics. They shape your so-called entertainment and the humorless PowerPoint presentations that we now know as popular comedy. They also shape the views and news of intellectual thought leaders whose laughable and ridiculous collages of insane delusions we are supposed to take for intellectual leadership. Where does all this come from? Consider, if you will, the consequences of doing thought experiments, the consequence of which sits before you today. With that caveat in mind, and it is a sincere warning, consider doing this thought experiment. Think for a second that there was a tribe, and that tribe had its customs. Now consider that tribe and its customs was earmarked for replacement with a new system that saw both the tribe and its customs as an impediment to its global vision. Think again that this tribe is your tribe, and the custom is that of Christian civilization, and indeed of Christ himself. This replacement operation is how we end up where we are today, with a state religion that proposes a rules-based order on our values. But what are those values in effect? Those values are not pro-Christ. They're not pro-family. They're not pro-nation. They're not pro-life. They're not pro-sanity. They're not pro-truth. They're not pro-beauty. They're not pro-reality. And finally, if you look at their effects, they're not pro-you either. So why are they there? Who put them there, and to what purpose? Today I will explore one of the reasons why noticing the obvious is so deeply controversial. That's because when you notice the obvious, well, the consequences are controversial. And the reason why that controversy exists, I argue today, is because we inhabit an experiment to abolish the customs of our tribe, which is Christianity, and our tribes themselves, and replace them with a new and improved replacement product under the aegis of liberal democracy. How this happened, who did it, where it began, and what it means for you is the subject of this episode of Frankly Today. Pointing out the obvious can carry considerable risks for your ability to earn a livelihood and have any kind of promising career. Since I've effectively committed career suicide anyway, I'm free to come out with this, largely free of consequence. The chaos that we inhabit today was predicted accurately and in alarming detail by the Catholic social teaching, which was largely written between the 1870s and 1890s. This prescient set of 9 encyclicals tells you many things. It not only prescribes the solution to the problem, but it describes in great detail how we get into the situation we find ourselves in now. And chiefly, and at the root of it all, is the deliberate defection from God, his divinely created natural order, and the kingship of Christ, from whom all authority and meaning ultimately flows. Once you replace that custom with other ones, what do you get? Chaos. There is a naive superstition that is spread throughout the liberal world. And that naive superstition is both naive and superstitious, because it seems to presume that when you abolish the awful superstition of the belief in Christ and in God generally, then what you end up with is a sort of open, liberated space. Now, of course, this is an obvious nonsense. If you get rid of the supply of meaning in people's lives, they will find it elsewhere. In fact, other meanings have been supplied. I argue today that the end result of the replacement of Christianity, the custom of our tribe, has been the creation of a new religion, a state religion, whose emblems you can see saturate your life in its every aspect. Where do these come from? I think it's interesting to view these as the customs of other tribes. When you think about the import of that statement, it sounds absolutely shocking. But today I'll explain to you how. You have elements of secular humanism, liberal humanism if you like. That's to say, the replacement of the worship of God with man. So you have a humanist tribe. You have, if you like, a cult of technology worship or technianity. You have identitarian tribes, such as those of sexual extremism and racial grievance. In addition, you have other ethnic and religious tribes whose beliefs either despise, contradict, or seek to replace those of the Christian religion. There are also strong elements of what you might call popular occultism, which derive from a very obvious tradition of black magic, if you like, Satan worship if you prefer, but the occult tradition is so mainstream today that it's invisible. So we have humanism, occultism, and various forms of worship derived from identity movements and from competing customs of other tribes. What this means in general is your tribe is bad and its customs are bad too, and all the other ones are gooder. It's hard to say that without laughing. I mean, the effects are obvious, it's tragic, it's terrible. In fact, it's civilizationally suicidal. But when you state these claims in simple terms, they are obviously ridiculous. This is the reason why these kind of things are heavily censored, as one look at my social media presence will show you. The Catholic social teaching is collected in a book by Etienne Gilson, whose edition is luminous because his explanations are actually worth reading and his summaries are very useful. That's one book that I would suggest you read today. There are others. One of them is Kenneth Clark's summary of his series Civilization from the 1960s, which is brilliant and wonderful. Another is War Before Civilization, which was written in the before times when you could publish books about things that happened before the state religion became fanatical. Today I'm also going to talk to you about things called books. For Zoomers like Walter, who derive most of their beliefs from things like the TikTok, and for the television-believing generation known as the Boomers, books are things from which you can derive ideas which are not broadcasted to you by people sponsoring them. Some of these books are interesting, and I would say that it's important to consider them if you want a fuller picture of what the customs are that have replaced the customs of your tribe. When you get rid of the supposed superstition of the tribal belief in Christ, you don't get liberated from superstition. I would argue that you get the replacement of that belief with other superstitions. In fact, I would go so far as to say that they are idols and they are destructive on a civilizational and personal level, amounting to an exhortation to either lifelong chronic sickness, actual suicide, or national suicide. So what I'm telling you is that your tribal custom has been replaced by the customs of other tribes. The rainbow movement is one example of a tribal custom which seems to dominate most spheres of public, state, and even religious life. Where did that come from? Towards the end of the 19th century, a man called Magnus Hirschfeld founded, I think in 1897, the first gay rights movement. From around 1921 in Berlin, he pioneered the world's first transgender surgery clinic. Magnus Hirschfeld was not a Christian. I've spoken to you about Sigmund Freud before, and about how you can see his work as the attempt to call normal life and normal morality that we inherited from Christ as a mental illness. And he prescribed that the liberation of libido or sexual desire, erotic fantasy, and practices was necessary to become healthy. Sigmund Freud was not a Christian. Wilhelm Reich was one of his students, and nor was he a Christian either, and he went even further and said that the family was a kind of authoritarian factory that just churned out fascists, and that the way to make society and the state healthy was to hypersexualise women and children. A few years before, in the 1920s, the Liberal Democratic Project was being put together. It was being put together between people like John Dewey, who is a liberal humanist and a bit of a technocrat, and there's a collection of his essays called Towards a Common Faith, in which he advanced the ideas, first really put together by Matthew Arnold in the previous century, that you could continue Christianity in its structures and in its nations, but without Christ, and instead you could supply a popular culture for people to worship, instead of the divine presence of the Lord himself. That was the common faith that Dewey imagined could be promulgated through the liberal democratic system. Together with Walter Lippmann, who is one of the godfathers of modern propaganda, he helped to found the Council on Foreign Relations. This became the international steering group of the liberal democracies that were created in the immediate aftermath of World War I. Walter Lippmann, who was an advertising genius, rather like Edward Bernays, Freud's double nephew, was also not a Christian. Walter Lippmann came up with a very novel way of controlling this new liberal democratic world. If you're going to be liberal and democratic, or at least if you were going to say you were, you can't go around bashing people over the head, censoring their social media, locking them up for saying things, can you? Oh no. No, instead, what you need to do, said Lippmann, is use mass media to create what he called a pseudo-environment. That's to say, a parallel reality. And he said that when you could put that into people's minds through mass media, you could manipulate that reality. You could manipulate the sense of reality that people derived from relying on mass media. This is how the public mind was made up. How the public mind today is made up is done in the same way. The technology has improved. We have screens in our pockets nowadays, and voices in our heads wherever we walk if we wish. The question is, whose tribal customs are transmitted through these devices? Not those of Christ. And that's not an accident. The liberal democratic system was always a technocratic system. It created these new tribal cultures, and it absorbed those in others in what you would call technique. Technique is basically the reproduction of a standard result through a constantly refined process. The technique of liberal democracy combines things like technology and the manufacture of mass belief and alternatives to the traditional morality, customs and culture inherited from our European civilization to produce a counter-civilization in itself. And it sought to replace everything with itself. How did it do this? Some people talk about the problem of modernism. Now, the modernists are a tribe in themselves. The modernists basically tell you that what's real isn't what's out there. The basis of reality is what's within the individual, in the self, in your imagination and your desires. This is the movement towards the interior. And why does that matter? If you look at a book, and I know this may fill you with horror, but if you look at a book, Kenneth Clark's book, Civilization, it's a wonderful book. It's really one of those books that you open up. You can open it up at any page, and it's full of wonderful things. One of the things that Clarke goes on about is about the meaning of art. And when people explain things simply, it really helps you understand them in ways that you hadn't seen before. And he does it in a very interesting way. He shows you these pictures of like Greco-Roman classical statuary and architecture. And he says that this represents one direction of art. It's full of light. It's intentionally beautiful. It's well proportioned. It causes you to look up. And of course, anything that inspires the love of beauty in you also inspires a higher purpose in mankind, whose ultimate origin is in God. So, he said, there's two types of art. One makes you look outwards and upwards, beyond yourself, to God, ultimately. But the other one, he said, made you look inwards, into a world of darkness and fantasy, a private, paranoid world, where the self is total and the rest of the world full of menace. He began that section with a picture of African totems. But of course that sensibility extends into the anti-art of the modern period. It's all about the self. Abstract expressionism is all about the self. It's all about the imagination, about desire, about the liberation from the rules. It's the art of the interior. It's modernist. That's why it's called modern art. Incidentally, if you're not yet sick of disappearing down rabbit holes, go and have a look at Francis Stoner Saunders' book, Who Paid the Piper? That's a really well-researched tome on the fact, and it is a fact, that the CIA sponsored people like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and a host of other talentless so-called modern artists, and indeed sponsored the Museum of Modern Art itself as a form of cultural propaganda. This was said to try and advertise the liberal West to the Soviet Union, but of course it worked equally well to denormalise the identification of art and culture with beauty, truth and God himself at home. So here again is an element of what you might call warfare, cultural warfare, or at least permanent cultural revolution. This indeed is a tribal war. It's always against the Christian tribe, and it uses all the others and adopts techniques from every other method to absorb them into itself. That way, it becomes more effective in replacing everything with itself. There was a mid-century art critic, a mid-20th century art critic in America called Clement Greenberg. He was very famous at the time, and he was the kind of person you'd go to get your opinions about what art was and what it meant, and why you were stupid if you couldn't see meaning in something as revolting as the insult to art that modern art largely is. And it's deliberately so, of course. A lot of them exult in it. Greenberg said there was no such thing as objective beauty or truth in art. It was all about taste. And of course, if you didn't agree with the tastes of people like Mr. Greenberg, you were an idiot. Francis Stoner Saunders will inform you, as will many others, that Mr. Greenberg was himself sponsored by the CIA to tell you this. This is again possible to be viewed as a form of tribal war. Why do I bother talking to you about dead art critics and miserable modern art? As if everything were some kind of psyop. There's a fair bit of mileage in that, because mass culture doesn't come from nowhere, and it is no accident that its end product that you can see today leads us anywhere but to God. In fact, it's determined to lead you inside, into the world of desire and fantasy, into the interior world. And here we'll look at the custom of another tribe, a kind of modernist or phenomenalist philosophers. There's a brilliant meme, in case you haven't seen it, that says philosophers forbidden, and underneath it just says, you know what you've done. Now, I wasted years of my life on modern philosophy, and it's rather like some kind of modern fashion show in the end, where a bunch of people desperate to be taken seriously appear on a catwalk in your mind in a series of increasingly bizarre costumes. None of it makes sense. In fact, some of them go out their way not to make sense. As modern philosophy proceeds from like the 1630s, from people like René Descartes, up to the contemporary bilge that's put out by people like Judith Butler, it seems to be deliberately concerned with obscuring any meaning or purpose or value and denormalising all your norms, by the way. That too is no accident. It doesn't really explain things. Someone pointed out to me once, and it was a great thought, I wish I'd had it myself, but I didn't. That all the philosophy that came after St. Thomas Aquinas was an attempt to refute him, which had failed. Once I heard this, a rather flickering low wattage bulb went on in what remained of my mind. I began to realise how many years of my life I'd wasted poring over the autistic rantings of Immanuel Kant, the insane idealism of Hegel, and the dreadful crime against the civilised mind that is 20th century French philosophy. The Catholic social teaching predicted all this. It said that any state that pursued the false idols such as the belief in human equality would produce chaos. A critical theory is advanced by radicals who believe that what they're doing is in the service of the liberation of all humanity, who are all equal, in essence. This, of course, is a fantasy. It's a false idol. And in seeking to secure this universal liberation, false idols are put before people to worship. These are the customs of a different tribe from Christianity. They are atheist, they are counter-Christian, they are immoralist, they are libertines or extreme liberals, and they're not alone. Together with the customs of other tribes of ethno-religious or indeed political or philosophical bents, you also have people like market worshippers who will tell you that there's an invisible hand that governs the relations of the market and that moralises market transactions and becomes a moralising force in society generally wherever markets are free. If you ever meet one of these ridiculous pompous fools, ask them, what's the moral value of a trafficked child? What's the moral value of an over-the-counter abortion pill? What's the moral value of a baby sold to a convicted homosexual sex offender? You might think I'm making this up, but if you look into it, these are true. Surrogate services do indeed provide, especially for, shall we say, families of a non-traditional background. Following the establishment of the Rainbow movement in around 1897 by Magnus Hirschfeld, this new tribal custom has been so successful that there are companies which exclusively cater to single homosexual men to supply them with babies they've bought online. If you've been convicted for offences against children of a sexual nature, that's no barrier to your legal right to buy a little human being that you've ordered on the internet. And aside on thinking, right, most people don't think. They'd rather die than do so, and in fact they do. This is a reason why I advise you not to have arguments with people. Right, arguments, they don't really help. You very seldom get to a point where you can just exchange ideas with people and you come away with a mutual, refreshed understanding. Sometimes it happens, fair enough, usually in controlled environments, very seldom in the wild, if you like. Usually what happens in a so-called argument is someone ends up hating you for telling them the truth. That's really what happens. You know, there's nothing more offensive, especially today, than telling people the truth, especially about themselves. They don't want to know it. People don't believe things because the argument's been won or the debate's been secured by evidence and facts and logic. That's propaganda. Do you think you got the liberal system that you have today, this basically satanic state religion of national and personal suicide, this death cult that you inhabit, do you think that was the result of a reasoned argument where the best ideas won? If you do, I refer you to my earlier remark that people would rather die than think. What people think is thinking, what they call it thinking, is attaching their feelings to ideas they've overheard somewhere or cobbled together from things that have floated into their head, like their head's like a home with no door into which strangers come and make themselves at home. Once they've relaxed and settled in into the furniture, you start to think of them as yourself, and you start to act like them, and you start to defend them, and you do. And if anyone points out, hang on, those strangers in your head, who put them there? Why do you think they're you? Well, then you get very, very angry, and you'll defend that because that's who you think you are now. This is basically what Walter Lippmann did, and what he suggested liberal democracy should do, and it has done, in creating a pseudo-environment in your head to control you. And I'm telling you that instead of these lurid fantasies of an active gun war, a civil war, you should consider that you're living through at least an attempt at permanent cultural revolution, which is a form of warfare. We are living through a tribal war, and the tribe that is marked for extinction and replacement is yours. The values that we are offered are not Christian values. They are consumer nihilist values. They are atheist, liberal, humanist values. They are quite often the values of other ethno-religious tribes who contradict or even are directly opposed to the teachings of Christ. There are social movements that are supposed to be liberationist, into which people infuse their intense moral passions, which have been made homeless precisely because they've been told it's stupid to believe in God. This is akin to cutting the head off our entire civilization. It also explains why people run around like headless chickens, seized by an unconfined moral fervour over meaningless things or even destructive things, like the war in Ukraine or George Floyd, and a series of other passing fads or frenzies known as the current thing. When you cut God off from the top of the pyramid of reality, there's nothing there. There's no sense, there's no structure, there's no meaning. All reality flows from God. Michael Polanyi said this in the middle of the last century, as I pointed out in the previous video. He said that this resulted in people being seized by what he called homeless moral passions. And those homeless moral passions need a home. People need to feel that there's some kind of meaning. And so they're given the meanings of these new tribes. One way of looking at what you might call the Star Trek Netflix multicultural paradise that has replaced our homelands with a permanent state of emergency. One way you could look at that is to say that it's a series of parallel cultures, in fact. Now, the idea of parallel cultures is interesting because, of course, parallel cultures, well, they never really meet. I mean, of course they do, but only really in moments of conflict. The rest of the time, they go about their own way, and they don't really have anything to do with one another. And they are defined as such because they're antagonistic to all the others. Consider the separation of the Tranningtons from the feminists and the rest of the rainbow movement, for example. The rainbow flag has bifurcated, if you like, into a series of subcategories or its own little parallelisms as well. So you have parallel cultures, you have people's actual ethno-religious culture, if you like. They come from different national tribes. They're together, but they're not really with one another. People self-select into communities of people like themselves. This is an obvious fact, it's deeply controversial, but there it is. But it's not just about race, and it's not just about religion either. It's not just about mosque, synagogue, gurdwara, and what's that other place that people used to go to? Oh, I don't know. That place that hateful bigots... Oh yeah, church. It's not just about that either. Parallel culture also includes culture of crime. Now, if you look at crime as a culture, you can see that that's a tribal custom that's been mainstreamed. In the 1990s, billions and millions of white boys in America began to be saturated with rap music, which is basically a theme tune to a lifestyle of crime. It's horrendous. If you think that that's a bit harsh, why don't you do another thought experiment? Get one of the top rap tunes from the real, well, I would say, NWA. Go and get a song from a modern London urban musician, if you like, and see how it's turned out in the UK today. And then translate its argot, or cant, into English. Cant is a word that was used to describe a sub-language, a language invented to identify a particular group of people and to keep their meanings and discussions impenetrable to outsiders. Thieves' cant, I think, is the first use of this, because in England it was noted that thieves had their own terminology and their own way of speaking. The queers of England had a thing called polari, where when the sin of sodomy was recognised as a crime in Britain in those benighted years before the current ones, the queer community would communicate their homosexualist desires to one another and their constant reference to sexual innuendo through a series of euphemisms known as polari. Criminals, pirates...
Arg, matey. Ye be breaking the pirate's code by disclosing our secret cant of yar, arg, ahoy, and booty.
Many subgroups have a form of cant, and if you like, the music of crime is a form of that. It's an argot, it's an idiolect, it has a status as a parallel culture. It's the language of a parallel culture, and it's the language of a culture of crime. And as with most cultures, it has its own moral structure, and the culture of crime is largely morally inverted, seeing decent moral behaviour as that of victims or chumps or easy marks. If you look into it, you can see that crime has a decent claim to being a parallel culture. Are these the pluralist values that we've been told the liberal system secures? The customs of every single tribe, all of them at scale, hugely damaging to yours, and anything but Christianity? Well, yes it is. And that's why I say it's fair to call this a tribal war. It's the war of all the other tribes against yours. Oh dear. It's very hard in that situation not to get very cross and become extremely militant. While I think it is wise to become continent, self-disciplined, to learn to command your own feelings and your own thoughts, of course it is. While I also like to get strong so I don't end up like Len, or looking like Walter. I don't think that looking at everybody as a target and the modern world as a target-rich environment is a healthy way to go about things. Try to think of yourself as a social missionary. Now, I warned you against arguing with people. And people who've been possessed by these other tribal customs are apt to be fanatical. You can't challenge their behaviours because their behaviours are animated by their beliefs, and their beliefs are motivated by their desires, and their desires are animated in a very occult process that make them believe that their interior world is reality. So if you are perceived to attack them, that's to say if you try and talk to them about whether their ideas and beliefs are a good match for reality, they'll see that as an attack. And then they'll attack you, perhaps physically. So be careful. Argument is not what you are told it is. Telling people the truth is deeply provocative, and that's because of the absorption of the custom of yet another tribe into our mass popular culture. And that custom is occultism. Occultism went from being a form of ceremonial or ritual magic through an initiatory stage to basically teach people that if they did these things and they went through these initiations, they could replace God themselves. Some people call it a school of godmanship. I would argue that if you're seeking to replace God, there's probably not much godly about it, is there? Of course, it's satanic, it's entirely selfish, it's motivated by desires, and, of course, the infamous late 19th and early 20th century occultist Aleister Crowley defined that system of magic as the art or science of causing change in accordance with will. If we fast forward today, you can see that there's one extremely popular tribe nowadays that's been virally transmitted, that's hugely self-destructive, that's utterly immoral, but wants to disfigure God's creation and announces that purpose itself, and that is the transgender cult. And what is that, if not the animation of private erotic desire and its projection into reality? These people not only seek to transfigure themselves and transcend their own biological reality by mutilating themselves on the basis of a sexual fetish, but they also seek the power and secure it to destroy your life if you disagree with them about any of this, or you refuse to say their pronouns. This is one of the many reasons why I will probably be dragged off live on camera into prison any minute now.
Does it ever drive you crazy? Just how fast the night changes.
Before Crowley came up with his definition of magic occultism, practical occultism being the science or art of causing change in accordance with will, they like to call themselves scientific illuminists. This derives, of course, from the idea of the Bavarian Illuminati, which we won't mention here because that's another rabbit hole. But the point is that these are also want to present themselves as science followers. Now, isn't it odd that the motivation of the deepest, darkest desires of humanity through ritualised techniques, that is to say the repetition of behaviour, perhaps through mass broadcasts, teaches people to follow the scientific method into feeling better about themselves and can alter your entire reality? If you look at it as a huge occult experiment, you can see the lockdown era is in an entirely different light. Or darkness, if you prefer. But where did it go after that? Well, it began to follow the science in adopting the scientific or scientist language And it ended up with things like chaos magic. As the mathematical theory of chaos theory came into popular vogue and taught you that reality was inherently unstable, chaos magic told you that from the point of view of the individual, there was no reality, there were only shifting systems of probabilistic truth to talk about it. And what does that do? It stripped away all the ceremony, all the ritual, all the clothing, the incantations, if you like, the smells and bells of the ceremonial invocation of demons to get what you want in life. Instead, it just came down to the stimulation of desire towards guaranteeing an outcome. And that desire is almost always erotic desire. And that it motivates, if you like, the individual magician to see their own will worked in the world. Again, remember the transgender cult. How erotic desire, an erotic extreme fetish, which is hugely self-destructive, has been weaponized to alter our reality. Look again at how the sexual extremism of the rainbow movement generally has been weaponized to alter our social, political and moral reality as well. First in imagination, then in reality. As the occultists like to say, the mobilization of desire through these tribal customs has replaced our civilization with not just a madhouse, but with a panoply of self-destructive behaviours that are all presented as liberation. These are the customs of, collectively speaking, a cult of death, because it gives us nothing but death and destruction morally, financially, nationally, spiritually, and epistemologically. That word means that we can no longer reliably talk about reality if we are enchanted by the state religion of all these new and dark competing customs of tribes. These replacement customs of other tribes have replaced our civilizational stability, our basis of reality, with a permanent uncertainty and incoherence, which is animated by a restless sense of desire, and the false belief that you can transcend your reality and save yourself entirely from who you are, simply by listening to what's inside you. You do you. That's what it tells you. It says to you that you are everything that there is, and all that matters are your deepest, darkest desires, and nothing should stop you from realising. This is the equality into which liberal democracy wants to deliver us by means of the customs of any tribe, but that of Christ. I found it quite disturbing to hear people talk about civil war so often, and it's been very popular recently, and I really don't see it happening in terms of people organising into armed factions. I think that it's very dangerous, and as again at the beginning of the video I explained that I think this carries water for the liberal system that created this permanent state of emergency with which it's replaced our civilization. I think the idea of civil war, as it's presented virally right now, carries water for the liberal system that replaced our civilization with the permanent state of emergency we live in now. It's going to use this to tell you to adopt digital ID and digital governance, so you can never vote them out of power, and so you can never make videos like this that point out how that power is exercised through the mobilization of the darkest desires of humanity, using the techniques of the customs of tribes, anything but Christ. ABC. Remember that the reason why I bang on about this is because Christ teaches you to look for the truth. The social teaching of the Catholic Church is grounded in the closest correspondence of the description of reality, in humanity, in the salvation of souls, in the composition of the state, and the just rebalancing of the economy towards the promotion of human flourishing. I can think of no competing political, moral, or social philosophy that is so total a recipe for the restoration of our civilization. If you can read, and you are willing to pick up a book, I suggest you do pick up Etienne Gilson's book, The Church Speaks to the Modern World. You can get it for free on the Internet Archive. And I write about it frequently myself, if you prefer to read it there. I'd like to remind you that although our world, our life, our inner life and our external world has come to resemble something of a battlefield, because it is, that you shouldn't really take a war mentality with you everywhere. I've tried to remind you that life is a battlefield, that the war has been fought and is continually fought for your heart, your mind and your soul, as well as your body, for the meaning of your life, for its purpose and for its value. And you must never forget that. But at the same time, you must remember that there's more to life than simply fighting to survive. Liberal democracy is, in its addiction economy, its mobilization of occult techniques to capture the minds of millions and ensnare them in what's effectively a death cult, this is a mass casualty event. Liberal democracy is a weapon of mass destruction. It destroys us inside, morally and spiritually, and it destroys our world outside, in a series of forever wars and a permanent war on our civilization itself. This is a mass casualty event, and I remind you, if you can, and wherever you can, to tend to those casualties whenever and wherever you find them. If you can help the sick, tend to the wounded, then I think it is your duty to do so. This is one way you can truly liberate yourself from the diabolical system that sought to replace everything of value in our lives with itself. We don't have to live like this. Neither do you. You should listen less to people on the internet like me, who are constantly telling you what to think, and go out and see if you can discover the natural wonder of the world. Life is beautiful if you know how to live it. Much of my work here basically tells you that liberal democracy thrives on selling you a series of false gods. Well, why not try the real one for a change, is my radical remedy to all the chaos and misery that's been created by worshipping false idols that results in a mass culture of death and destruction. This is obvious now. You can't resupply meaning by simply inventing it. You can't buy yourself into heaven. You can't even buy yourself into a new identity in terms of the transition phenomenon. It doesn't matter what you call yourself, you're still who you are, and that is a result of what you do, the decisions you make. And if you don't understand the powerful forces that have been created and developed and refined to shape your decisions, if you don't understand the powerful forces informed by technology and ever-refining technique that are exercised to shape those decisions and to put those thoughts into your head, you can never really understand who you are or what the purpose of your life is. I think that real liberation begins, if you like, especially in this media-saturated age, with mental hygiene. If you like, information hygiene. You could start by asking, what's in my head? Who put it there? What purpose does it serve? How does it make me feel? What kind of behaviours does it make me want to indulge in? Are these any good for me? Shall we say the popular conservative thought leader has taught you the wisdom of having a wash and cleaning your bedroom. I would suggest that you should extend that hygienic ritual to your mind and go through the thoughts in your head. Try and write down some of the patterns occasionally. Keep a notebook and a pencil, not a phone, not a tablet, but an actual pencil and a piece of paper by your bed, and write down the thoughts you have at the end of every day, and you'll notice patterns. And then you can start to say, well, these are the programs in my head. Maybe I don't want them here. You are allowed to say no to your own thoughts. You are allowed to delete them. You're allowed to ask who programmed the software in your head, and you're also allowed to reprogram it yourself. In short, you can exercise some mental discipline. And this is effectively the same as spiritual discipline, because it teaches you that you do have the power of self-command. You can choose between negative behavioural patterns, self-destructive thoughts and behaviours, and ones that don't destroy you, and that lead you to do good things towards human flourishing, towards the truth, towards the light and beauty in the external world created by God that Kenneth Clark said was the highest category of art. You can make your life into that work of art if you prefer to do so. You don't have to be degraded along with the degrading modern world. You don't have to submit to Martin Eslin's cultural denormalization program of the inevitable devaluation of all ideals, purity and purpose. You can opt out of that, and you can opt into life, truth and beauty instead. And that begins in here, with your mind. And although that muscle may be weak, the more you exercise mental discipline, the easier it gets. But bear in mind, most things that are good for you are painful. And despite what Walter might tell you, I do actually lift these weights. And yesterday, for the first time in a long time, I did squat day, and that's why it's a relief sitting down now. If you do things that improve you, they do cause you pain. They do cause you to suffer. You just get used to suffering. You get better at it. It's better to suffer in the service of good things than bad, because they make you better. They make you stronger. And I don't think you can be good if you don't have a degree of strength. You need a degree of strength, physical strength, fortitude, moral strength, mental discipline. These are all forms of strength. Virtue itself is a word that derives from the idea of masculine strength. If you're weak, you can't be good because you'll give in to evil. You'll surrender to temptation. You'll fear pain. You'll fear harm. You'll even fear death. If you start to get stronger mentally, physically, morally, spiritually, you'll enjoy life more. You'll be less afraid. You'll care less. You'll be able to laugh at your anxieties. You'll be able to reject the addictive poisons of the consumer nihilist lifestyle. And you won't get so angry about the fact that other tribes naturally insist on their tribal customs over yours. That's one important thing to say, is that tribes aren't to blame as such for having different customs. It's just important to distinguish them from other ones, so you can make an informed choice. If you're told that the state religion that's composed of all these toxic tribal customs that hates you and your tribe, if you're told that's all there is, well then that's miserable. It's depressing. There's no place for you in life, and you're going to fall into despair. Probably into patterns of self-harm, addiction, dependence, and so on. Take a series of so-called antidepressants that destroy your mind, and become the kind of chronic sick casualty that's the optimal consumer. You might console yourself with an endless series of My Little Ponies, for example. Start watching children's cartoons for consolation, or invest your identity in a fursuit. You can do any one of these things that's completely pointless, and it just dissolves your life into nothingness, and you end up hating yourself, and partially rightly so, because you have chosen that path in life. You can choose to do something else. You don't have to listen to all this. It's understandable if people fall into despair if they think there's no exit. There is an exit. You can choose other tribal customs. These are concealed from you as tribal customs as part of, if you like, the sales pitch. If you think there's no alternative than what's on sale, well, you're compelled to buy something, aren't you? Or you'll be empty forever. Or you can walk out of the supermarket and not buy any of that trash. And similarly, you can reject the supermarket place of ideas that only really hawks junk food for thought that makes you sick and even dependent on it. It makes you forget what real nourishment is. If you start to push these poisons out of your mind and your body, that too will strengthen you. And you'll learn to love only things which are good for you. Again, all these people throughout the 20th century who pushed modernism and humanism and atheism and liberationism in all its forms, all these people told you that the concept of sin itself was bad and it was destructive and it made people feel guilty and miserable. That's selling evil as good. Sin isn't a prohibition on having fun. God tells you not to sin because sins destroy you. This was known to people in the medieval period. They were surrounded by pictures and images of sin. They were constant reminders that not only did hell await you if you spat in the face of God all your life, but if you became a glutton, you'd be objectionable and bloated and probably get ill. If you gave in to lust, not just sexual lust, but lust for worldly goods, then you'd eventually end up being devoured not only by a series of uncontrollable passions that eventually annihilated your interest in any of those things anyway. You'd end up with the jaded appetites of the Marquis de Sade, experiencing a sort of death before the death of the body. In short, you desensitise yourself until you became numb. If you become envious, envy isn't jealousy. Envy is not the desire to possess what other people have. It's the desire to destroy it so they can't have it. It's the desire to wreck other people's happiness, ruin their beauty, undermine the truth. There's all kinds of envy. But again, envy is perhaps the peak of the sins for its self-destruction because it's purely destructive. It's entirely destructive. You don't even get anything out of it. All you do is destroy. And sin is destructive. And God does not want you to destroy yourself. He wants you to flourish. And that's what the Catholic social teaching says we should do with ourselves and our state. And that's why I constantly exhort you to read it. We don't have to live like this, and that includes you.